What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm Necrotic.
I'm Jammin, John.
And we have an album review for you. So, another one that came out on the 23rd of September was the debut full-length from a band, Writhing of Earth and Flesh. This comes out again on the 23rd of September on Everlasting Spew Records. This band formed in 2019 in Melbourne, Australia. This, again, is their debut full-length. They did have an EP that came out in 2020, and this is straight up fucking death metal.
Yep.
So naturally, we're gonna review it because reasons, very obvious reasons.
I mean, right. You'd never guess in a million years, I don't think, that we like death metal.
2 million years.
Yeah, 2 million years.
Now, this is kind of legit my first exposure. I was kind of jammed tracks from the EP sparingly by this gentleman over here. So I really didn't have a lot to compare this to in terms of their EP, but he has listened to their EP multiple times.
Yeah, I found their EP just trolling through Spotify at random a few months ago. It only has 2 tracks on it, which was kind of a bummer because I really dug it. Their EP I found was a lot of like ambient death metal, very dark and dreary, again full of the things I love, chugs and dissonance, but notably more ambient than this release is.
I mean, for my first exposure to this, I would say 100% right out of the gate, this band loves Morbid Angel. And I would say specifically like the Steve Tucker.
Yeah, we were talking about that. Even more nods towards Steve's side project, Warfather.
Yeah, the riffs are thick, they're chunky, the drums are fucking bruising as hell, very guttural, just kind of guerrilla roars, vocals. You know, it definitely has that sort of like Morbid Angel sound. And production-wise, this is done by Dan Lowndes of Cruciamentum. He does a lot of production work. He actually pops up here on the track Uncreation to throw in some vocals. And every time I see his name mentioned in production, I was like, man, really would love a new Cruciamentum album. But,
right,
you know, hey, he's doing some cool stuff for other bands, and that's really awesome. But yeah, the production on here, surprisingly a bit more compressed.
Yes.
Than what I'm used to from Dan Lowndes. Like, he's known for, like, very sludgy, ugly death metal. Like, a lot of his production kind of sounds like, you know, Cruciamentum, which is just some fiercely disgusting but very atmospheric death metal.
Yep.
This sounds more tight, more chuggy, more riffy.
Yep. And while that's not a bad thing, it just lost most of the ambience, if not all of the ambience that's found in the EP. And that's not a bad thing whatsoever, because it's still pretty sick.
Yeah, I mean, it's heavier than hell.
Yeah.
And there's still, like, very atmospheric, kind of distant, interesting melodies in here. The title track especially has almost kind of like a Mastodon-like flair to some of the crawling riffs and the distant melodies on it. But they also bring in, like, giant death doom breakdowns every now and then, kind of, like, slowing down to that incantation speed.
Yep.
Coming out of, well, incantation speed, the other one.
Then you get a little bit of Middle Eastern melody, kind of more akin to Nile, I would say. And then that kind of vibe happens again later in the album in Squalid Sanctum, where you get a more quiet, kind of dark and dreary melody in the beginning, and then these bone-crushing riffs, and then back to more dissonant melody.
Yeah.
Yep.
And bone-crunching riffs, that's the bulk of this. Like,
yes.
There are ferocious chugs, giant, like, single chugs, triplet chugs. I mean, this is like an all-you-can-chug buffet, so naturally this gentleman was very happy. But it kind of keeps this sort of, like, plateaued energy of just, like, yeah, everything is just beefy and fucking just driven. Lots of blast beats, but they do switch up to, like, slower tempos here and there. And there is a bit of atmosphere in here too, but it is mostly about the giant fucking riffs.
Yeah, and I think the atmosphere even so much occurs with the dissonant riffs, because this sounds like it was recorded in a small room. Yeah,
like a very small room, like an elevator, which is kind of shocking again because of who mixed this. Like, generally I think of like more open sounding albums when Dan Lowndes is at the knobs. But this may have been exactly what the band wanted, like that very tight, sort of like 90s death metal sound. It does sound very like analog and very aggressive.
Yes.
But again, it sounds kind of tightened up. And that isn't just in the production, that's also in the songs too. The songs, generally, I think the longest song in here is like a little bit over 4 minutes.
Yeah, it's like 4.5 minutes and some change. Most of the songs are 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. There's one song that's 2.5 minutes, and it's like they scrunched everything humanly possible into these songs. which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but like one thing that I think we both found is that there's not any breaks between songs. It's like it's just one transition into another song.
Honestly, if you hadn't told me where the track breaks were, especially in the first 3 tracks, Monolithic Extinction, That Which Becomes Death, and the title track, I would have thought that those were transitions within songs.
Yep.
And I don't know, like honestly, they kind of would have worked as one continuous song because it kind of has that, you know, riff a minute style that you would hear in slightly more technical, like old school death metal.
Yeah.
But the fact that that is so bullet trained and then there's not like clear track breaks, like you can kind of guess where they are. Like That Which Becomes Death actually has like a, you know, vocal outro. Like they're, you know, screaming the title of the song or at least a phrase in the chorus. But the way it cuts off, like, there's like that much room between that last word and then the next riff, which honestly could have been a transition within a song. So it does get a little bit confusing. And that is kind of most of the album, but where they do break it up, namely on Passages of Misery and Squalid Sanctum, there are some clear breaks there. And honestly, Passages and Squalid Sanctum do something that I think should have like appeared more on here is let some of the riffs breathe. Again, not only is the album kind of compressed, but the songs are. So that means riff a minute and there's not a lot of breathing room in between riffs. And in terms of like breaking them up with, you know, like more ambient moments or like different kinds of crawling riffs, by the time you've hit the midway point, you've almost heard everything
all
that
of
they're
what the song
do.
is going to offer, yeah.
So they kind of hit a formula at a certain point. And this album isn't very long. It's under a half an hour. But in those 2 songs that I brought up earlier, Passages of Misery and Squalid Sanctum, they let them breathe.
Yes, they let everything breathe, as a matter of fact.
And there's a break in between the tracks that is discernible. Like, you know that's the beginning of the next track.
Passages of Misery, I think, is where the band actually starts to show some dynamic capabilities. For most of the songs, it's verse, chorus, you know, blast beats, something slow and chuggy, blast beats, something slow and chuggy. Here, they let it go into a nice intro with a melody, and then they play something really chunky and heavy, and then it kind of smooths out a little bit. There are some definite even breakdown moments, because I could say that all the songs have a breakdown, which is true, because they all have chunky, nasty riffs, but like here it was notably a breakdown. Like the song slowed down enough, there was a little bit of build going on, and really sour-faced lemons in here. It's got some bendies in it. Ooh.
Very sludgy riffs. And I like how it's like a deliberate, like, slowdown. Like, you can kind of hear it slow down. It isn't just an abrupt transition. And being abrupt is definitely a thing on here, too, where songs lead in very explosively. And that's almost all of them. And I want to say Squalid Sanctum was the first one in here that kind of opened up a little bit more subtly. Like, there was a little bit more of a build. Rather than just sort of detonating right away with, like, big, thick tremolo riffs and chunky riffs and like a breakdown or some weird noodles, blast beats, you know, the death metal stuff. I don't like dislike any of that. In fact, that's kind of the shit I like about death metal. But when you're opening the songs kind of in a similar way, that kind of hurts the pacing of it because you kind of want some more dynamics, some peaks and valleys. Like just a bit of like transitional atmosphere would have helped.
Yeah, something to separate the songs from one another because, I mean, realistically speaking, I could say the first at least 3 to 4 tracks on this song kind of sounded the same in the aspect that their structure was the same and there weren't any breaks and there wasn't anything to slow down and it was a riff a minute. And that's great. I'm not knocking the band for that either.
No.
I'm just stating that for the listener, for the ears, you need something to make the tracks jump out, to differentiate from one another. And when you don't have much of that until you get to like Passages of Misery and Squalid Sanctum, by this point you're almost done with the record. And like I could have used a bit of the really cool stuff that's in Squalid Sanctum, I could have used it earlier on, per se. Now, I won't totally knock the end of this record because one of my favorite tracks of all is the last track, Portal to Unhollowed Realms. It's an instrumental, but goddamn is that riff catchy.
The whole song's catchy.
Yep.
It sounds very energetic, and again, being an instrumental, it does stand out a bit more. It pretty much packs everything that they're doing on this album, but I think at a more like deliberate pace.
Yes.
There's room for riffs to breathe in there, and well, I mean, I guess another knock on here is the vocals are kind of monotonous on here. It's sort of like this standard sort of gorilla growl. Like, it's very aggressive, but it's very in the front of the mix. And generally, like with death metal vocals, like if you're going to have sort of a, monotonous delivery, like one style, the best to sit in the back.
Yeah, draw him back a little bit. Like, this guy is very out front. I hate to say it, kind of a one-trick pony. It's just growls. The only track that's not growls is the one that Dan appears on.
Yeah. Well, there's also, like, some backup screams every now and then, but the growls are so much more forward that the screams kind of get lost a bit.
Yeah.
And honestly, maybe pivoting between the two would have, like, broken it up a bit. But, yeah, the monotonous vocals, that's another thing that kind of hurt this album. But at the same time, the riff work on here, I think, is fucking sick.
Yes.
It just needs to be broken up. So
yes.
The problems I have with this, for the most part, don't really hurt this that much. It just sort of hampers the listen.
I'll agree with that. If you love sick, chunky chugs, it's all over this. It's very heavy. There's not a dull moment in this record where it's not, again, skull-crushingly heavy.
You just got to figure out which track you're listening to.
Yeah, exactly. Jamming this on, say, something like Spotify, there are no track breaks. So, we literally had to, like, stop and pause just to figure out where the next one was.
Actually, if we got a commercial in there, that probably would have helped break it up a bit. I'm not pro fucking commercials on Spotify. Spotify can suck my ass on that one.
I pay for Spotify.
I'm not paying for fucking Spotify.
Yeah, there's no denture commercials or
God.
aspartame
or some podcast that I
rich
don't listen to.
chocolatey Ovaltine.
Is that still a thing?
I don't know. That sounds good, though. So overall, I'm going to give this record 3 stars. It's not a bad listen. Don't let us, don't let our nitpicking and critiquing here dissuade you from jamming this album. It is very heavy. Once again, if you love bands like Morbid Angel and Immolation, you're probably going to dig the fuck out of this album. Who doesn't like heavy, crunchy chugs? I, for one, love them. If you've watched any of this channel, you know that I'm a sucker for that shit.
And Dissonance.
And Dissonance. My gripes are minor. And in the same way that Nick portrayed it, I don't want it to hurt the overall listen of this album. It just needs to be broken up a little bit. And I would like to hear, the riffs breathe a little bit more. And we didn't even talk about lead work because there isn't a whole lot of it. The lead work that is there is pretty solid. It just doesn't stick around long. This is definitely not bad for a first full-length release. I'm very curious to see what this band does in the future. But yeah, it's a 3 for me.
I'm also at 3. That felt right, like, listening to this, because, like, musically I don't have a lot of complaints. Mostly it is just about pacing it. Letting things breathe, breaking up the tracks a little bit more. It makes for just kind of an odd listen when, you have no idea what track you're on. Like, if you hadn't told me we had moved on to track 2 or track 3, I was like, are we still on the first track? Because, this is pretty, fucking good. It's just, are we on the first track? Like, no, we're not. There's a lot of stuff on here I could say, it's like, yeah, I've definitely heard this before. Morbid Angel, of course, Incantation. But there are bands that definitely, ape certain bands that do it really well, and I think this band does. Like, bands like Malignant Altar. Clear Morbid Angel worship, but fucking hell, they do it really well. This album just needs something to break it up, like a little bit of transitional atmosphere. All the tools to be successful in terms of being a badass death metal band are definitely here. They just need to be refined a bit. And honestly, like, this could have stood to be longer. Like, it's, again, under a half an hour. I feel like if they expanded out some of the spots here, maybe squeeze in some more leads, or, just kind of anything to sort of break it up and maybe extend really cool riffs, because there are a ton of them.
Yes.
I could have stood for like another 10 minutes on here. Still, like, whatever gripes I have, most of them aren't that bad, so this, again, is a 3. But I strongly recommend checking this one out. I would say check out their EP too. Just check out this band in general. It's Australian death metal. It's pretty much, it's pretty much going to be good.
Right, you can't go wrong with Australian death metal.
It's as venomous as every fucking animal there.
Yep. And again, if you watch this channel, you know that we're suckers for Australian death metal, so...
Australian metal in general, dude. Fucking awesome scenes over there. So, if you enjoyed this review, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there's a link down below to thrallsmetal.com, where there is a link to our Patreon. There's also a bunch of stuff in Thralls Metal you can check out, like shirts. We have our podcast up there, or at least like the audio versions of some of our episodes, namely the rankings. And we're also going to have eventually some new merch, like the hat. That's probably going to be a thing here relatively soon. Relatively.
Relatively.
And, you know, some other stuff we're thinking about. They still haven't told me no on the grenades. Like, not a hard no. Like, there's been some soft no's. But you got to get, like, 30 or 40 of those of stacked.
I've said no.
To really talk me out of grenades.
I've said no, but I haven't done, like, a commanding no. Like, fuck you, that's stupid.
Is he talking right now?
See what I'm saying? So, and I'm probably the only one that said no. I don't think any of the other Thralls have been here to witness him saying he wants grenades. So
I think Shred would agree with me.
Maybe. Maybe.
Anyway, grenades definitely coming. Jammin John said so. Pretty much totally approved of it. That's at least what I heard, but I don't really listen to him. And of course, thank you to all of our fans. It's absolutely amazing doing this. You guys make it fucking worthwhile to get the awkward thank you part. I gotta do it though, because I feel thankful every fucking time I do one of these.
I do too. I don't get to often start off with the thank yous, but indeed, thank you all so much for continuing to tune in despite the increasing stupidity here of the Thrallers.
We're not getting any brighter.
No,
or younger.
We're definitely not, or younger. Neither of those things, but thank you. That's one thing that is consistent with all of us here. We appreciate the fact that you still, stop by and watch videos and comment and, tell us every now and again how much we suck or how much you love us. Thank you all for that. Still, to this day, I'm shocked that this is turning into the living, breathing entity that it is. I never thought we'd get where we are, so thank you for that from the bottom of our black little hearts.
It's probably the most meaningful thing I've done in anyone's basement, let alone my own. So thank you for all that.
Yeah.
And once again, we will catch you later.